Thank you for joining us in the intro session for SIG-PM. This is going to be the deep dive session, so a lot of the content will look familiar, and we'll start going a little deeper into some of the things that I mentioned earlier today. So my name is Stephen Augustus. I am the Product Management Chair for SIG-PM, and
yeah, my name is Ihor Dvoretskyi. I'm a developer advocate at Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and I am a co-chair and one of the original co-founders of SIG-PM.
Trying to figure out what to do with my laptop. All right.
Yeah, we can cover our history briefly. Yeah, that's fine.
Cool.
So we can cover our history briefly for those of you who didn't attend our intro session today early this morning. So SIG-PM is one of the earliest SIGs in Kubernetes community. We initially been started as a product management working group. So we had a few initiatives within the Kubernetes community. How can we enhance our features backlog? How can we enhance our roadmap process? How can we work closely with the engineering team on the release-related items? So we've started the PM working group at the same time. In a half a year approximately after the working group was bootstrapped, we've decided to convert it to SIG to have the defined charter, to have the regular meetings, to have the typical scope, and all these items that make the difference between SIG and working group in Kubernetes community. These days we are mostly focused on our backlog, on the enhancements backlog, on the roadmap stuff, but we'll cover that later, like with more details.
So we talked a little bit about the governance landscape of Kubernetes, and I think the slide is kind of important to give you an idea of the scope of the project and the different the different ways we organize in the project. So first off, there are all these pretty diagrams. First off, there's the idea of committees. So committees in Kubernetes are essentially bodies that are organized to delegate some sort of authority, right? So we have a few different ones. The steering committee is created specifically to delegate all authority for the Kubernetes project, right? So how do we organize as a project? How do we handle code of conduct issues? How do we, the steering committee delegated that authority to the code of conduct committee, right? So we have this kind of, the idea being that these are kind of project elders, and they have a good scope of the entire, the entire landscape of Kubernetes, and can best understand who should be working on what day to day. From the committees, we have the idea of SIGs, and SIGs are special interest groups for Kubernetes. We're organized in about 31 SIGs at this point. And the SIGs are kind of two modes. One is a horizontal SIG, so cross-cutting across the project. So things like SIG-PM meeting, right? SIG architecture, SIG contributor experience, and so on and so forth. And then we have vertical SIGs, or domain-specific SIGs, which focus on specific problem sets. So whether it's Node, or auto-scaling, or scheduling, or Azure, or AWS, so on. And then the last two are working groups. So working groups are cross-SIG efforts, right? Working groups are meant to be tightly scoped. They're supposed to serve a certain purpose, and they have an expiry date, or they're supposed to have an expiry date. So some examples of working groups might be the LTS working group that we recently spun up for SIG release. There's a security auditing working group, and a bunch of other ones. I think we're probably like 7
and
now.
as I mentioned before, PM was originally the working group, not a SIG.
Right. And one more smaller body of organization is the sub-project. So sub-projects live within the SIGs, and sub-projects are specifically focused on code organization, right? So whether it's something on the API machinery side, or if you've ever heard about the release team, the release team is a sub-project of SIG release, right? So.
All right. So at SIG-PM, we have the defined charter. We We just recently been working on it, on enhancing it, because the original charter was developed at times when so many different SIGs which SIG-PM is collaborating today didn't exist. Like SIG release is the SIG that we are collaborating so much these days. But at the beginning, when SIG-PM was established, there was no SIG release. The same with SIG architecture, the same with some other SIGs. So the situation in community was a bit different 2 years ago when we originally developed the charter. Today, we're working on enhancing it. So at the moment, it's updated, but we are going to have like more charter updates during 2019. But we'll cover that in our plans, right?
Yeah, and that's definitely the part of the purpose for that is so that you can clearly understand what we're meant to be about, and in fact help bring your expertise into drafting the charter. So you can probably expect to see that Q1 of 2019.
Yeah, and one of the responsibilities of SIG-PM is that we are responsible for staffing some of the roles within the Kubernetes release team. So as I mentioned before, we're closely working with SIG release, which is focused on the release related questions. Steven is one of the co-chairs of SIG release as well. So. We are staffing people like enhancements lead, which was called a features lead, the person who is responsible for tracking the features and enhancements backlog and roadmap for the upcoming release.
Yeah. So Ihor was actually the original features lead. Been doing it since. Was 1.3?
Yeah, so approximately 1.3 when even the position didn't exist officially. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, and then I took it over afterwards.
Features-related jobs since that times. Yeah, we are staffing the release team communications coordinator, the person who is responsible for the release marketing initiatives and so on. And we are also going to focus more on the roadmap.
Yeah. So if you've ever seen the CNCF blog posts about Kubernetes releases, the 5 days of Kate series that we do once a release comes out, the CNCF webinar that talks about the releases, that's all kind of concentrated around the communications coordinator role for the release team. So.
Next. Yeah, just a brief update again. We discussed this with more details earlier this morning, but recently, SIG-PM conducted the survey asking Kubernetes consumers and Kubernetes companies that are using Kubernetes for building their projects, building their products, building their services, or just their end users to fill some data for us to we could understand how Kubernetes is used these days and what can be our next steps in developing it for 2019, 2020, and later.
So this time around, we're not going to go into the survey details. I think that was a good exercise for the intro. But we're going to start talking about the KEP process. So kind of the SIG-PM survey was part of the work that we did. It's not really correct to say last cycle, but the last few cycles we've been working on. The KEP process is, so for people who are not familiar with what a KEP is a Kubernetes enhancement proposal, right? So it's a means of which you can suggest changes to the project, right? Whether they be program management focused, or API changes, or changes around cloud providers, so on and so forth, right? So it's anything that you could conceivably think about being a change to the project, you can submit via KEP, right? So the KEP process was created back in August 2017. This was initially suggested by Caleb Miles. So Caleb is one of the technical program managers at Google. He is SIG-PM chair, focused on, he's done also SIG release right. Chair. So just kind of having this wide swath of knowledge across multiple SIGs, he basically said that we need a better process. We need to follow a better process, whether it's something similar to the PEP process in Python or the Rust RFCs. So that's kind of where we got some of the inspiration from. So essentially, Caleb was initially focused on this stuff, and we wanted to have an opportunity to kind of jumpstart the process, get more people involved. So, part of us presenting here is to get our product and our program people excited and involved in the process. And these are just kind of some of the housekeeping steps that we've been working on in the last cycle to get that done. But we're going to speed into what's cool. Why is it important? So initially in the Kubernetes ecosystem, we had the idea of enhancement proposals. Enhancement proposals lived in the community repo. Design proposals at this point are kind of stale. I think that's the nicest way to call them. But it's a combination of like architectural documents and ideas for APIs that have already been implemented. So they're not really proposals anymore. They've actually been implemented, right? So the life cycle of what was a design proposal is kind of fallen out of sync with what is maintained in the repo. So we needed to find a way to actually manage that life cycle. And like I was saying, we gathered inspiration from the PEP process in Python and the rest of our RFC process.
Yeah, in parallel, we also had the features repo where we tracking the features themselves as the features backlog. It was closely related to the design proposals, but they were not so consistent and in a direct connection between each other, unfortunately, sometimes.
Right. Yeah. So the real problem around tracking features and putting them on a spreadsheet is one, it's manual, it's human work, and two, it's on some set of humans to keep it in sync, right? So we want to kind of move away from that and figure out ways that we can start automating this process. So what we came up with, well, just kidding, wrong slide. I'll let you take this one actually. So.
All right. So. With KEPs and with designing KEPs as a follow-up to features and to design proposals, we try to solve the goal. We try to solve the issue of that we have multiple artifacts that are distributed, multiple release-related artifacts, multiple feature-related artifacts that are distributed across different places in the Kubernetes community. So as Steven mentioned, our design proposals were placed in community repo, in the subdirectory of the community repo where was their organic place. At the same time, we tracked features in the features repo, which was absolutely independent, and the only way of connection between the feature and design proposal was the cross-linking between them. So yeah. The feature description mentioned a link to the design proposal, but it was the only reference to it.
And hopefully, like, someone is actually linking them, right?
Yep.
If not, you have no idea.
Again, yeah, it was a human job to track if all the feature information is filled. We had a feature template that every feature owner had to maintain while submitting the feature. But unfortunately, sometimes like not all the data was filled out, and it gave us like another time to review and to fill us. So that was the human job. We also had another artifact for tracking features, which was the features tracking spreadsheet. Again, since Kubernetes 1.3, we've decided to track all the features in a spreadsheet, and it was the replication of that effort that we did in the features repo. So it was one of the most common questions: why do we track features in the features repo and in the spreadsheet? Because they're duplicating each other. But the answer is that spreadsheet is way more readable. Much more easily readable by humans. So if we'd like to share with people who are, for example, doing some marketing job, or they're doing press releases about the upcoming Kubernetes release, it will be way easier for them to read all this data from a single spreadsheet rather than from 100 or 50 issues on GitHub that are tracking the current information there. But for developers and for the community, for people inside the community, it was easier to track all that feature stuff within the repo on GitHub, because we have everything on GitHub. So Kubernetes, again, it's an open source project. It's absolutely open, and we are trying to keep everything on GitHub in a source control and some source control system, even for tracking the historical changes. All right.
All right. So why would you ever need a KEP, right? And this is a little wordy, but if an enhancement would be described in either written or verbal communication to anyone besides the KEP author, you should consider writing a KEP, right? So that essentially means you should write a KEP very, very often. I think it's an exercise for a developer. Two, it's an opportunity to succinctly say what you're trying to say, to succinctly talk about the motivation for this change, right? And if you're able to capture that motivation in a succinct manner, it's a lot easier to gather buy-in across the project, right? Again, there are 31 SIGs at this point, so this is hundreds of people across multiple time zones, different companies, different agendas, right? If you can convince them that your idea is a good idea, it's easier. It's a lot easier to move forward. So try to always write a KEP is my byline for the day. Right, so now we're gonna dive a little bit into actually how you form a KEP, right? So one of the key factors of creating KEP is the idea of having metadata associated with it, and this is because we're kind of crossing between this product and program management role and then also into engineering. We want to be able to take this is after assessing things like the feature tracking spreadsheet and the features repo over multiple Kubernetes release cycles and saying this is a process that does not work for anyone. But the people that are involved in this process are, one, day-to-day, they're not PMs, right? They should not have to be concerned with that stuff. They should not have to be, there should be an expectation that they're writing a level of docs and tests for these things, but we also want to provide them an instrument that we can start to automate this product and program management stuff away from the process. So that's essentially what the metadata is for. And then from the metadata, we've got the motivation summary, and we kind of talked about the motivation a little bit, but also the artifacts. So all of these artifacts are things that we've noticed from design proposals that haven't worked well, are things that weren't easily surfaceable in certain repos. And especially now that we move into the state of Kubernetes where we're essentially breaking out the monolith, right? So the same way we say we're building microservices, we're breaking out the monolith, right? We're trying to do the same thing with Kubernetes. So taking a lot of the code that used to exist in core Kubernetes and pulling that into cloud provider repos, pulling that into the external cloud, external controller managers, and the implementations for CRI, CNI, CSI that live inside of the Kubernetes SIG organizations, right? So now it's not just a single ingress point for understanding how the code is organized. I think it's 152 repos that we manage right now. And that might be a lowball number, right? So it's very important to have a means of structure across all 31 of these SIGs, the different time zones, and all that good stuff. So this is a quick idea of what the metadata would look like. So all this metadata is leading up to building a tool around proposing and moving KEPs through different lifecycle states. So you can see that when you create a KEP, you'll be able to say that you created the KEP as the author, title your KEP. We're getting rid of the KEP number because we quickly ran into collisions using the KEP number, so that we're doing UUIDs now, so that should be fun. Reviewers, approvers, the SIGs that are going to be participating in the KEP, the state that the KEPs are in at any one point. So we'll start to talk about the states as well as the different sections for the KEP. But you can see that some of these sections laid out are kind of what we were already speaking about, as well as if you've ever looked for docs in trying to implement a Kubernetes API as either an operator or a developer, they're not always easy to find. Right? Depending on what you're doing, you might have to know someone or work some black magic or stay up at the right time to hit someone in the right time zone to get information about this stuff. So the idea that we can kind of bring guides into one place for organization is huge. So KEPs, again, this is a cross-project event. Being able to have the information in one place for the people who are going to approve these ideas, the people who actually need to collate the ideas day to day, so the release team, the communications coordinators within the release team, the enhancements lead who usually builds the feature tracking spreadsheet. So there's also some processes that are a little tangential to the KEP review process, including the API review process. So there are a bunch of Kubernetes elders that live in SIG architecture. So we're talking the Clayton Colemans, the Brian Grants, the Tim Hawkins, that if you're suggesting the Daniel Smiths and the so on and so forth, right? So if you're suggesting a change to a major Kubernetes API, you can't just submit a proposal and say, like, here you go, we're just going to change it. There is a fairly intense API review process, and that's a little outside of the scope of this talk. But if you want more information about it, I can put you in the right direction afterwards.
Just to clarify, like, Kubernetes API is stable. The core Kubernetes API is stable. That means that if there are any changes to it, they have to be extensively verified by the entire community. And we also have the API deprecation policy. That means that if some part of API will be deprecated and is deprecated, is marked as deprecated, it will be finally removed only in 12 months, right?
Right. Yeah. And I mean that deprecation policy, as well as the way that we handle, it allows us to make some guarantees about, like, version skew, right? So the expectation that you can use a Kubernetes API server of a certain version, and it will function with a kubelet of a certain version, right? The only way to make those guarantees is to have a committee of people who are willing to say that stable means this, beta means this, right? So alpha, anything can change. Beta, there are a little stronger guarantees. A stable API should not change, right? So we've gone over motivation. I'll not bore you with that again. But these are some of the artifacts that we're talking about, the graduation criteria I was alluding to. So what does it mean for this feature that's being developed, or this enhancement that's being developed, to move from alpha to beta to stable, right? Is it we're just gonna spin up a POC and see what happens? Is it do we have enough docs to actually explain this to someone and expect them to consume it and in some sort of meaningful way? Do we have enough? Does it conform to a certain profile? Right. So we're spinning up a conformance group, I believe, for SIG architecture. Right. So to build out conformance profiles for what it means to be Kubernetes. Right. When you say Kubernetes, when you say something is Kubernetes supported, does it meet this model of being Kubernetes?
Yeah. What is Kubernetes actually?
Yeah. What is Kubernetes? What is Kubernetes? And then finally the guides that we were talking about, and there's also the experience reports. The experience reports are very important because in the movement from these alpha, beta, and stable states, we need feedback. Right, and the only way to gather that and make it actionable is to store it somewhere that everyone can access. Right? And so I'm going to start speeding through this stuff because I realize we're starting to crunch on time a little bit. But the KEPs, as I was mentioning, they have various associated states. So there's a draft, provisional, implementable. These are the standard states. Once you lay down a motivation and a summary for what your KEP is, it's essentially in draft mode, right? And anything can happen. We try to get this idea of merge early and iterate often, right? A lot of people get hung up, and I know if there are any developers in the room, there's this idea of perfectionism when you touch code or when you touch a process. So it's easy to get hung up in a pull request for a long period of time. I've seen KEPs hang around for months. Right, or years. There are some design proposals that have been out for years. So the idea that we can lay down a quick idea of what, like the motivation summary for it means the community can immediately say, this is a great idea, or this is a terrible idea, we should never do it, or there's an API that already does this function, let's just move on. Why don't you implement it using CRDs or something, right? So After your KEPs have been reviewed, and the SIG essentially says this is something worth working on. This is something that we should budget time for, or or find the volunteer army that all SIGs are, and kind of support this effort. Right, your KEP moves into a provisional state. Right, from the provisional state. And actually, it's been functionally approved. It's been discussed in the SIG, documented. We move into implementable. Like someone can actually work on this now, right? And there are a bunch of like oddball states that KEPs can fall into too. So deferred, it's maybe a good idea, but we're not gonna go after it right now. And deferred, is what that means is left as an exercise to the SIG, right? If their deferment period is a year. We don't hold. We try our best not to set deadlines in SIG-PM. The best you can do, like one, it's an open source community, right? So everyone who is here is volunteering to be here and volunteering to work in service of the community, right? So it's important that we try our best to give them the tools to do good work without dictating what they should be doing, right? We have no authority to do that.
We have an advisory role, not authority.
Right. Your KEP can be rejected, withdrawn, or replaced, right? It's all English, you understand what's going on. But the reason for having each of these different states is because we want to be able to track this stuff, right? If an idea gets shot down, we don't want to just shoot it down and cast it in the bin somewhere. We want to be able to say, when someone proposes a new idea, being able to come back and say, hey, this came up in 2016, and this is the reason we rejected it at that time. Maybe whatever extension framework that we needed to make that work didn't exist yet, right? So maybe we can reassess that idea and flip the state again. But unless we keep that history, we don't have the ability to introspect on those decisions. Right? So now I'm going to speed through the tool, like really speed through the tool. So we created Caleb basically wrote this tool. It's like 11,000 lines of code or something. I created a library that has fully tested and all that good stuff that allows you to essentially move through these different states of a KEP, right? So there's the KEP CLI tool. So a init is the initial stage, and that'll allow you to generate the template, the entire level of documentation that you would need to get started as a KEP author, right? So then you can move into proposing your KEP and laying down what your motivation is, figuring out who you're going to try to get buy-in from in the SIG, right? So finding your reviewers and your approvers, and then actually so your KEP is in draft state at that point, right? And then you can push your KEP up, you create your pull request, get your reviews, and start to gather your buy-in and move towards a provisional or a implementable state. So now this action is on not the KEP author, but a SIG approver, right? So the SIG approver is then going to use the same tool and do KEP CLI accept, right? And that KEP will then flip. Its metadata will flip from draft to provisional, and then they will push a PR to say we've accepted this idea. We will consider moving forward with it, right? So this is also, being in this provisional state means it's not tied to any specific release cycle. Again, it could easily fall into deferred status. It's really just saying we will consider doing this, right? Now the KEP author will come back, right, once that's merged and be able to do a KEP plan. The KEP plan will essentially lay out some of those additional directories and things that we were looking for, like how does a developer actually operate? How does an operator actually use this tool? How does a developer create an ecosystem around the tool? How do you teach someone how to do that? Right, documentation for that, as well as the experience reports, more on the motivation or summaries, and graduation criteria, right? So this will be, if you saw some of the metadata, like you see that each of those are laid out in different directories. And the reason that we have it in different directories is because it gives you an opportunity to, well, I'll tell you later. So afterwards, the SIG approver will come back and say, okay, this is, now that I've seen you've made it a much more meatier idea, and this can actually be broken down into chunks of work. We're gonna do that as a SIG. We're gonna delegate this work and figure out how to drive that down across a set of releases, right? So, I mean, this is part of the vision of what we're trying to achieve. Being able to have the proposals tied to features. So the idea of an enhancement is something that spans across multiple release cycles, right? Now, because it spans across multiple release cycles, we also want to be able to capture what happened in a release cycle, right? Was the development team actually able to execute on that idea, or did it slip, right? We want to capture that information as well. And then we also want to be able to break it out into the idea of features, right? So features initially were what we were tracking in the features repo. The features repo is now the enhancements repo. The features are now scoped to singular release. If you can't get it done in a single release, if it's a grander idea than a single release, it's an enhancement, right? So you should file a KEP for it. But this diagram is kind of like the grand scheme for what we're driving towards. And of course, based on, this is going to be strictly based on community feedback. The only way we're going to be successful with this is if we're getting input constantly from the SIGs and from you lovely folks. So being able to have a process that's automatable, that you can apply to product and program management means we can start to build the elusive roadmap, right? There is no roadmap for Kubernetes. We've gotten the questions a few times, like, what's happening next? I've done media interviews where they're like, where's Kubernetes going in the future? I don't know. Like, I don't know. I'm one man, right? But being able to scrape data that is as readily available, that is touched by developers every day, and turn that into something that's presentable to people who don't want to have to deal with GitHub issues or PRs, right? That's the goal, right? If I'm able to present a roadmap for Kubernetes over the next 2 years, like, who thinks that would be valuable? Few people, right? Okay. So like I said, this is kind of what we're driving towards in 2019. We're going to come back to the SIG-PM Charter and make sure that we have input from product and program and project managers, and make sure that it aligns with the what steering committee has laid down as the charter expectations, right? From there, we're going to kind of go into process documentation. So all of the stuff that I've been talking about, it's codified in my mind, it's codified in Ihor's mind, and Caleb and Jace, but this may not be as clear to someone who is not in this talk or is just not aware of the process overall, right? So we want to make sure that the DAC and the RACI of the KEP process and then actual KEP implementation is defined. We want to make sure that we actually define the terms, right? What is a KEP? Right. If we don't start with what is a KEP, right? It's or an enhancement or a feature, right? So we want to make sure that that's clearly defined, and then also make sure that we kind of elucidate the entry and exit criteria for each of those KEP states that we were talking about earlier, right? So that's the super high level overview for 2019. But the tool, the KEP tool is a huge part of this, as well as being able to eventually bring these to the contributor site. So if you've ever seen the contributor site, or what was beta contributor site, I think at some point, but having the ability to basically dial into different SIGs and say, oh, I'm curious about this one feature or this one enhancement, and dial like, okay, well, I want to see what SIG autoscaler is up to for the next 2 cycles, right? And having a site where you can present all that information that's backed by this KEPs library, right? So that's what we're hopefully end of year, maybe. Don't quote me. Don't quote me. Don't quote me. And then all of that leads into these ideas of like cross SIG planning, right? The idea that we can one make these roadmaps visible, and then 2 be able to coordinate release planning events across every SIG, right? And do that in a manner that is actually like viable for a team of 7, right? So this is. If you guys want to take a quick snapshot of that, that's.
We actually almost ran out of time.
I know. Yeah. Down to a minute. All right. So this is the team.
Yeah, the most important information here is the homepage of SIG-PM. So how can you be involved with SIG-PM? How can you join us and start contributing here as a PM, as a product manager or program manager, depending on your scope and your desire to contribute there. So yeah, we have the regular bi-weekly meetings. We have a Slack channel. We have a mailing list. So please join us. All these communication channels are open for everyone. So please do it.
Right. And finally, do you have any questions? We have like a minute for questions.
Yeah.
Let me run out to this guy. But you got to get it on tape.
Hi, great talk. Quick question. There was a quote that suggested if it's something worth communicating to somebody, it should probably be a KEP. And then you mentioned if it spans multiple features, it should be a KEP. There's kind of a disconnect.
If it spans multiple release cycles.
Yeah.
Right.
So what's a feature and what's a KEP, and what's the relationship? And also, second question, at what point does the technical design get sort of written down and reviewed? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So wow, that's a lot. Features are essentially scoped to a single release cycle, but they can be associated with KEPs. They can be associated with enhancements. Imagine you were designing a system that was like a three-tier web app, right? And you lay down the application side. The application side is maybe a feature. The database is a feature, right? And the middleware is a feature, right? And maybe your DNS layer is a feature. Right, but the entire idea of deploying that application and that would be considered the enhancement, right? So I'm going to deliver this application, and it's composed of these features, right? So was that close enough of? Yeah, exactly, right. So,
we ran out of time.
Out of time, but we can offline it.
Track is everywhere. Thanks everyone for joining us, and see you at the conference.
Thank you so much.